There are the experiments of Wilder Penfield, who was the pioneer in epilepsy neurosurgery from the 1930s to the 1960s. Dr. Penfield, who worked in Montreal in Canada, was the first neurosurgeon to systematically operate on the human brain when people were awake. The brain doesn't feel pain. The scalp can feel pain, and the skull can, but he would give local anesthesia so the patients didn't have pain. And he would work on the brain while they were awake in an effort to identify the focus of their seizures and to remove the focus from the brain so their seizures would stop. And he operated on upwards of 1,000 patients like this and very carefully recorded his results. He was a meticulous scientist as well as a neurosurgeon. And he began his career as a materialist. He believed that all of the mind originated from activity of the brain. But by the end of his career, he was a passionate dualist and was a harsh critic of materialism. And he was a dualist for several reasons. First is that he repeatedly observed that there were aspects of the patient's mind that no matter what he did to the brain, he couldn't affect. You know, he could elicit memories by stimulating a part of the brain. He could make a muscle move or make a patient have a sensation, but he couldn't change their consciousness. He couldn't change their intellect. He couldn't change their sense of self. There was a fundamental core, the person's soul, that no matter what he did to the brain, remained the same. So he said there was something he couldn't reach using material things. The other observation that he had, which I think is absolutely fascinating, is that he asked the question, why are there no intellectual seizures? And when people have epilepsy, the epilepsy can follow various patterns. Commonly, a person will have jerking of a muscle. Sometimes so many muscles jerk that they actually go unconscious. Sometimes they have a tingling on their skin, or sometimes they'll have a funny smell, or sometimes they can even have a little behavioral tic. But they never start doing calculus. They never contemplate justice or mercy. They never think about Shakespeare. So Penfield says, why aren't there intellectual seizures? If the mind comes from the brain entirely, the mind is material in some sense, well then you ought to have seizures that make you do addition when you can't stop. You ought to have seizures that make you think about politics and you can't stop, but you don't. He says there are no intellectual seizures. And he says what that implies is that the intellect is not the brain, because otherwise you would have intellectual seizures. So Penfield was a very profound thinker on this matter. He was the pioneer in the study of the brain. And he conclusively showed, in my view, that there is an immaterial aspect to the mind, particularly the intellect, particularly the ability to reason, to use logic. And he started out as a materialist and he finished his career as a passionate dualist.